Imagine waking up cramped, disoriented, in total darkness. The air is thick, suffocating. You reach out, but your hands hit solid walls. You're buried, alive, somewhere underground. There's a small tube feeding you oxygen, but you know it won't last forever. You're totally alone with only one hope: that someone will pay to get you out. This is the horrifying story of Stephen Small, a wealthy man who became the victim of a sinister plot that would leave him buried alive in a homemade coffin, left to suffocate in the dark earth. The tragedy of greed, betrayal, and terror is one of the most shocking crimes of the late 20th century. It's 1987, Kankakee, Illinois, a quiet town nestled in the west of America. Stephen Small, a 39-year-old businessman and the heir to a successful publishing empire, was a well-known figure. As someone who came from wealth, Stephen had lived a life of privilege. However, his reputation wasn't just based on his family's fortune. Stephen was respected in the community, involved in various local projects, and was known for his approachable nature. He had a wife, Nancy, and 3 young sons. But even in a small town, wealth can attract envy, resentment, and ultimately, danger. One person who had taken an interest in Stephen's fortune was a man named Danny Edwards. A small-time criminal, Edwards had a grand plan, a plan to make money quickly and with minimal risk, or so he thought. With his girlfriend Nancy Risch, Edwards began scheming. Their target? Stephen Small, the man they believed could deliver them an easy payday. They devised a sinister plan to kidnap Stephen and hold him for ransom, confident they could pull it off without getting caught. It was late at night on September 2nd, 1987, when Stephen received a mysterious phone call. On the other end was a stranger with a disturbing request. Stephen was instructed to leave his home and drive to a remote location, with the caller hinting at urgent business matters that needed immediate attention. Stephen left his house, likely without much thought. After all, he was accustomed to handling various business situations and had done similar things before. But this wasn't any ordinary call, and what awaited him was beyond his worst nightmares. As Stephen arrived at the specified location, he was ambushed by Edwards, who forced him into a vehicle and drove him far from town. With Stephen subdued, Edwards took him to a desolate wooded area where he had already prepared a hole in the ground, a hole that held a small, homemade wooden box. This box, measuring just a few feet across, was Stephen's prison. Edwards's plan was simple but terrifyingly brutal. He intended to bury Stephen alive and demand a ransom from his family for his release. To keep him alive long enough to get the money, Edwards had included an air tube and a small light inside the box, providing Stephen with minimal oxygen and just enough comfort to delay the onset of complete panic. Imagine the fear, the panic, the overwhelming sensation of helplessness as you can hear dirt being piled above you, sealing you underground. For Stephen Small, this was no nightmare. It was his reality. As Stephen lay trapped in the dark, cramped box, he had no choice but to rely on Edwards and Risch to follow through on their ransom demand and release him. He could do nothing but wait and hope. But the fear would have been inescapable, knowing his life was in someone else's hands. Meanwhile, Edwards called Stephen's family. His demand was steep, $1 million for Stephen's safe return. But Edwards felt sure of himself. He believed that Stephen's wealthy family would be able to gather the money quickly, and that once he had the ransom, he would be able to leave the area undetected. But the ransom demand and Stephen's terrifying situation did not go as Edwards planned. Back at Stephen's home, his family was thrown into a state of panic. They contacted the police, who immediately mobilized a search and began tracking the ransom call. The investigation went into full swing, with detectives scrambling to locate Stephen before it was too late. The police traced the calls and were closing in on Edwards and Risch, who began to sense that the situation was spiraling out of control. Edwards had given himself a tight deadline, a window that was now closing with each passing moment. As authorities moved in, he was beginning to lose his grip on the plan, realizing that his so-called perfect crime was anything but. Despite these escalating events, Edwards and Risch continued to evade police detection long enough to keep their plans moving. Stephen was still underground, alone, and terrified, waiting for someone to rescue him. As law enforcement closed in on Edwards and Risch, they were eventually taken into custody. The police knew Stephen was buried somewhere nearby, and time was of the essence. They pressed Edwards for information on Stephen's location, racing against the clock to find him before his oxygen ran out. Finally, with information from Edwards, authorities found the burial site, a desolate patch of land on the outskirts of town. They hurriedly digged into the earth, hoping they weren't too late. But as they opened the box, their worst fears were realized. Stephen Small had not survived. The air tube, Edwards' haphazard attempt to keep Stephen alive, had malfunctioned, depriving him of oxygen. He had died alone in that dark box, his fate sealed by the greed and cruelty of his captors. The scene was devastating, and his family and the community were shattered. The crime shocked Kankakee and soon captured national attention. It wasn't just the brutality of the act, but the cold, calculated nature of the scheme that horrified people. The idea that someone could bury another person alive as part of a business transaction was unthinkable. Danny Edwards and Nancy Risch were charged with murder, and their trial became a high-profile case. Edwards was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Risch, who had played a role in planning the crime but wasn't directly involved in burying Stephen, maintained her innocence, claiming she hadn't fully understood what Edwards planned to do. Despite this, she too was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, though she continued to seek appeals and eventually won partial relief. For Stephen's family, the horror was unimaginable. His children had lost their father, and his wife had lost her partner. Kankakee would never be the same, with the small case serving as a haunting reminder of how quickly life could be ripped away. Stephen Small's tragic death is more than just a story of greed and cruelty. It's a chilling reminder of the dangers that can lurk even in the quietest of places. The Small family never truly recovered from the loss, and the story of Stephen's death continues to haunt Kankakee decades later. Today, the case serves as a symbol of caution and tragedy, a story that reminds us both the dark side of human nature and the vulnerability we all carry. No matter how much wealth or status one has, no one is truly safe from the potential of evil lurking close by. Stephen Small's life ended in unimaginable fear, trapped and buried in a small, dark box beneath the earth. His story remains a terrifying testament to how quickly a life can be taken by those driven by selfishness and greed. And while justice was served, the horrifying reality of what he endured will not be forgotten. Thanks for watching. If you found this story chilling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more truly tragic events. And remember, stay vigilant, because you never know what kind of evil might be lurking close by.